Okay, so we've talked a bit about categorical logic, these all no, some are not statements. And, you can use these to, model and think about a lot of the arguments we make, but they're not really sufficient in themselves to think about, to make, or to evaluate even some pretty simple arguments. Let me give you guys some examples. One of these is just a Star Trek example, whatever. I like Star Trek. I actually never watched Voyager, which this one's from, but um, so one of my students was really excited. She's like, "I love Voyager." I'm like, I don't know it that well, but anyway. So Tuvok or Paris is lying. Vulcans don't lie. Tuvok's a Vulcan, so Paris is lying. Now, if you think about this, this is in fact a valid argument. If these premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. Now, the problem here is you couldn't even really translate all of what's going on here into categorical form. Vulcans don't lie. You might say, well, okay, that's no, Vulcans are liars or something like that. But Tuvok or Paris is lying. How in the world do we even translate that? We haven't seen that yet, much less seen how we're supposed to deal with it. Scarlet or Colonel Mustard committed the murder. If Mustard did it, he used a gun. Murder weapon wasn't a gun, so Scarlet committed it. None of these could you translate into categorical statements. None of these are going to go into all, none, some form. And yet, if you think about it, you can see this is a valid argument. This is good deductive reasoning. So, how are we going to handle these sorts of arguments? Well, to handle these arguments, you need to think about what we call disjunctions, either or arguments, and conditionals or hypothetical statements. Kelly calls it hypothetical syllogisms. The terminology really doesn't matter too much. Just know, if-then statements. Now, for both of these, there are some logical rules. And I think your best strategy is just going to be to memorize the rules. For all, none, some statements, you have the Venn diagrams. They work really well to model the statements and for us to see what's valid and not. With these if, then, and either or statements, it's just easier to remember the rules. You can kind of kludge if-then statements into Venn diagrams. I'm not sure it's super helpful, though. And either or, they're just not really useful at all for them. Okay. So let's start talking about these two types of statements. And the easiest, and one I don't think most people have any trouble with, is the disjunctive syllogism. Either Scarlet or Mustard committed the murder. Scarlet didn't do it, so Mustard did it. Or you might think of this class where, it's really hard. We know that one person will get an A. Imagine there's a curve, and the professor's like, well, one person's going to get an A at the very least. And you know that Sarah and Bob are the two best students, so one of them is going to make an A, right? Well, if you know that's true, if they're the two best, the A will go to one of them, and Bob didn't get the A. Somebody has to get it if there's a curve, so it's going to be Sarah, right? Pretty common, not super hard reasoning. And again, you can strip this down. The whole point of deductive logic, the whole point of formal logic is to strip an argument down to its form. We want to be able to recognize arguments with the same form, even if they're about very different things. Maybe they're a murder mystery. Maybe they're about who's going to make an A in this class. Same form. So, what's the form of these arguments? A or B, you might say either A or B, but you can just say A or B. Bob makes an A, Sarah makes an A. You have these two statements. Philosophers will call them propositions. It's just a statement. One of these statements has to be true. A or B, Bob will get an A, Sarah will get an A. Mustard did it or Scarlet did it. Not A, so B. If we know that one of them has to be true, but we know that one of them is false, then the other one has to be true. Disjunctive syllogisms are not all that tricky. I don't think most students have trouble with these. The only thing that's at all hard about them is that the or here is the inclusive or. We use or in two different senses. We use the inclusive or, which means at least one of the two, A or B, is true, but they both might be, right? You can think of some statements like this. If you have kids, you will know this is true. If you're going to have kids, you will learn this. Baby's crying, he's either poopy or hungry. Well, he might be both, right? You might go to all that trouble of changing the diaper. Baby is still cranky. Well, he's hungry, right? If he's cranky, he's poopy or hungry. But, he might be both. Or you might say A students are either hardworking or intelligent. Students who make all A's, got to be one of these things. If you meet somebody who's an A student and you figure out they tell you they study 20 hours a week or something, you're like, oh, they're hardworking, so they must be stupid, right? That's not good reasoning. You could be both hardworking and intelligent. If you had a statement like this, all it's saying is at least one of these is true. Now, but a lot of the ors we encounter in day-to-day life are exclusive ors. A or B is true, but not both, right? Baseball game's going on, the Yankees will win or the Red Sox will win. One has to be true. One of the teams, if those are the two playing, has to win, but it can't be both, right? If the stewardess says you can have beef or chicken, both are going to be terrible, right? But if she says you can have beef or chicken, you can't be, I'll have both, right? That's not an inclusive or. It's one or the other and not both. Now, we will talk a bit more later about how to handle the exclusive or. But the reason, gosh, there's a long history of this, there's a lot of reasons, but the most basic reason that we use the inclusive or is it's actually simpler. The inclusive or is only saying one thing. One of these things is true. At least one of these things is true. The exclusive or is actually more complicated. It's saying two things. It's saying what the inclusive or does, A or B is true. One of these things is true, but it's tacking on something else. It's also saying, and one is false. The exclusive or is actually just the inclusive or with but not both tacked on. A or B, but not both, right? So we use the inclusive or because it's actually simpler, it's a better place to start, and we can build the exclusive or on it. For the time being, this distinction's not going to be super important, but just know we will talk a bit more about this. We will be talking about the inclusive or for the time being, and pretty soon, probably even next week, we will talk about how to handle the exclusive or. That is really the only thing that is tricky about disjunctive syllogisms. But, it is worth keeping in mind. Like I said, I don't think most people have trouble with these. Now, what people do have some trouble with are conditional or hypothetical statements. We will spend a lot more time on those. Those are a lot trickier. If people have trouble, it's going to be with them generally. So we'll start talking about them in the next lecture, and then we'll talk about them actually in a couple more after that.